So in this video, I'm going to quickly explain the G-comp effect in Grainferno, which stands for granular compressor. But before I go into too much depth, let's just hear an example. So I have this sound loaded up. And now when it's being run through Grainferno with a lot of the vertical compression cranked up pretty high, let's hear that. At the beginning of that, it sounded pretty much like a compressed version of the sound. But the granular compressor actually works a lot differently than a normal compressor. It works on a per grain basis. So on each individual grain that it generates, it will analyze that for the loudness and then adjust that grain in loudness up or down, the whole grain at a time. And this is really useful in a bunch of different ways. For one, let's just see if we highlight a quiet part of the sound and we turn off the vertical compression. We can hear that it's audible, but it's not at a kind of a usable volume, I would say, in the context of a track. But if we crank the vertical compression, it's now at a pretty steady volume to kind of what we were working at before. And the nice thing about this compression and how it works on a per grain basis is clearly we're doing a lot of compression, but that's not really affecting the envelope, the audio envelope, and it's not really affecting when we play multiple notes at once. So because it's working on this per grain basis, we're getting a really clean compression without any of the kind of compression artifacts and the pumping that you would get from a normal compressor. And this is especially useful when you are mixing in quiet parts of the sound, quiet grains, and loud parts of the sound. For example, with the scatter control, which will randomize the position in the audio file. When we have the vertical compression cranked up, even though all those grains are overlapping, we're hearing what would have been the quiet ones just as loud as the loud ones. So those kind of tails and those reverb effects we're hearing just as loud as the main hits of the drum sound. And without the vertical compression, it would sound more like this. Okay, so I think that explains the basics of the effect. Let's go to a different sound where this might be a little bit more pertinent. This is an instrument hit with a really quiet tail. Let's hear what that might sound like, just the main part of the sound. So that sounds pretty nice if we add some scatter to it. We actually already have a pretty usable instrument right there. But if we tried to explore the quiet parts of the sound, and I'll turn the vertical compression back off, to see what those might sound like, well, they're pretty inaudible. We couldn't really use those without cranking up the output gain or something like that. And at that point now it's going to be hard to go back to the loud parts of the sound if we want to start to work with those, either with this position slider or with some scatter, right? But if we crank the vertical compression, now we're able to work with the whole file pretty easily. So let's hear what this part of the sound sounds like. So that sounds a lot ghostier. It sounds a lot more ambient than the main hit of the instrument. And so that's an interesting character of the sound that we wouldn't really have been able to hear unless we were using this vertical compression control or doing a lot of manual gain adjustment. And also, if we look at different parts of the tail, we'll actually see that they have different character. And again, this is something that would have been hard to really explore unless we had this control. So let's look at that. And just to show you again with the scatter, when we're mixing in the quiet parts overlapping with the loud parts, we end up with a really steady sound that we wouldn't get without the vertical compression. Where we get very sparse sound. Okay, so we've looked at a lot of the vertical compression and we've been working in this radical mode, but now let's explore some of the other aspects of the compressor. So I'll look up a different file that ships with Grainferno, and this is a vocal stem.
What if I told you I was?
And so as we can hear, it's pretty processed. It's got a lot of reverb. And the reverb's already pretty loud. So the compression wouldn't do too much, but if we actually turn on the inverse compression mode, we're gonna have a lot more of a dramatic effect. And so we've been looking at the radical, and that just pulls the quiet parts to be louder as you increase the vertical control. The threshold works in a fairly similar way. It's a slightly different algorithm, and those are good to bounce in between to see which you like the sound of better. But the inverse is a lot different. That will make the loud parts quiet and the quiet parts loud as you increase the vertical compression. So let's just keep the scatter here. Let's add some randomness to the pan so we can really hear the individual grains pretty well. Okay, so we hear a really randomized sound there, and that could be useful in all sorts of ways already. But if we add some vertical compression, we get a different character of the sound. Where now what is really emphasized are those reverb tails. So the inverse compression is another way to kind of bring out a different character of your sound in a more experimental way, I would say, compared to these two modes. But let's jump back to the radical mode and look at the horizontal control real quick. So I've already explained that the vertical control will pull up an entire grain in terms of its loudness. The horizontal mode works more like a traditional compressor that works within each individual grain. And really what we found to be the most interesting effect of that, and so that's kind of what we emphasized in this control, is the distortion that you might get when you have really low time variables, like really low attack, really low release in a compressor. So let's hear what that sounds like. And so that sounds really crunchy, and if we actually randomize it, since it works per grain, we can use all these granular modulators and have like randomness per grain or a grain pattern or something with the grain sync LFO. But let's just do the randomness for now. Let's add some more randomness with the cutoff and the resonance, and we'll get a really chaotic and dynamic sound here. Where now each grain has a random kind of distortion type of compression, random filter, cutoff, and resonance, and pan. And if I actually adjust the amount control, so this is a really useful control, by the way, is the amount control on the random modulator, where you can turn down all the randomness all at once. If I turn that down, we'll hear a much simpler sound. Actually, what we could do is add the randomness to the scatter as well. So it has a pretty similar effect, but now we can adjust the whole thing with just this one amount control. Okay, so now we're getting pretty far from the granular compressor, but hopefully that video, this video went over how that works and some of the things you can do with it. There's a lot more that you can do with it. If you're interested in any more videos, definitely leave suggestions for things that we can cover in Grainferno. And go to the Baby Audio forums, and there's a whole Grainferno section where you can discuss Grainferno or granular synthesis in more depth.